Hi, Max.
Hey, Bob. How's it going?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
Good. Actually, let me just shut this door for sound.
Let me explain while you're doing that. I'll explain to people that you're in Caracas, Venezuela.
Yeah.
And your bandwidth seems adequate at the moment. Your image may freeze occasionally, but your audio is being recorded separately, so we'll probably be okay. How you doing?
Good.
So let me introduce
I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah.
I've been here since Saturday and have been getting around a lot, seeing some activity from both sides, and looking forward to seeing a lot more as the situation continues to not develop in the way that people in Washington expected.
Okay, good. You're going to make predictions. Let me say a little by way of introduction. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and audio podcast. You're Max Blumenthal, renegade journalist. Is that what it says on your business card? Renegade journalist?
Yeah. Maverick, like in the tradition of John McCain.
And Sarah Palin, yes, with whom I know you're very close. So you are an author of you're a journalist and author of some books, most recently Goliath, a book about Israel. You're co-host of the Moderate Rebels podcast with Ben Norton. And if people want a mainstream perspective on foreign policy, I recommend the podcast. And, more specifically, I think it's safe to say a perspective from the left. We're going to talk about Venezuela, where you are. And one reason I want to talk to you, I don't know much about Venezuela. I'm not fit to judge the merits of anyone's perspective particularly. But one thing I have found in looking at the way the mainstream press covers areas that I do know at least a little about, like Russia and the Middle East, that sometimes the mainstream narrative is incomplete at best and sometimes wildly misleading. And I know that in the case of Venezuela, you certainly would agree that that's the case. You are, not just you're critical, of course, of U.S. policy, not just Trump, but Obama and so on, but also you're more sympathetic to the Maduro regime than almost anyone I hear on mainstream media is. Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't put it in those terms, but, I'm not going to spend my time challenging your characterization.
Okay. Okay. Then, in other words, don't believe anything I just said, but we don't have time to tell you what the actual truth is. So anyway, up to sympathetic with Maduro, you're probably fine with, right?
I wouldn't reduce the whole system or situation to one character, but, I think people who are familiar with my work or who listened to our last podcast will know that I'm, an opponent of U.S. encouraged or U.S. Propelled regime change operations. Okay. I think it's really destructive.
Okay. So let's, there's a lot to talk about because I really do think there are some things that have been left out of the kind of mainstream narrative probably. Let's start with just the recent action. Yesterday, there were protests. What we mainly heard about here in America were protests against the Maduro government in favor of the opposition leader who's been recognized as the legitimate president by the United States, some Latin American countries, and so on, Guaidó. Were you at that demonstration? Then I gather there was also a pro-Maduro demonstration? Yeah,
and I wasn't able to get to see Maduro speak at Plaza Bolivar, but several days ago I was at an event where working class Venezuelans were lining up for hours. And the lines, I wouldn't say they were endless, but to walk to the end of the line would take like 5 or 6 minutes. And we filmed it. We have a report up at grayzoneproject.com by Anya Parampil about it, where she interviews these people. I tweeted about it. And basically, these people were lining up to sign an open letter to Americans denouncing U.S. intervention, including sanctions, but also the threat of irregular warfare, war, what they consider an economic war on Venezuela. And there was enormous enthusiasm, not just for this government, which is under attack and which does face a lot of opposition internally, but enthusiasm, but just kind of anti-imperialist sentiment. And people wanted to insist to me, knowing that I was from Western media, that they were not being paid or induced or coerced to be there, that they were doing this out of their own support for Chavismo, the kind of legacy of socialism that Hugo Chavez has left this country. And then yesterday I went to the opposition rally, which was fascinating on a lot of levels. This was held between the affluent areas of Altamira and Chacao, which is like the financial district. And you really get a good sense of the class divide and the race divide and the polarization of Venezuela when you see both of these events, when you see people pouring out of the working class barrios outside the city, and then you go into the, middle class and upper middle class and upper class areas of Venezuela. People are lighter skinned, they're dyeing their hair blonde, they're wearing brand name clothing. A lot of them speak English. They're very, when they realize that I'm from the US, they treat me with, I get special privilege at this event. And much of the National Assembly, which was held in contempt, was on stage. Juan Guaidó spoke. I got to hear him speak in person for the first time, which was remarkable in how underwhelming it was. I tweeted that he has all the charisma of a filing cabinet, but that you don't need much charisma if you're the self-proclaimed leader of a country installed by Donald Trump and recognized by Wikipedia, but not necessarily elected in a national election.
I just looked at Wikipedia lists two presidents, Guaidó and Maduro, and under each it says partially recognized or something. So
disputed.
He's halfway there. So,
there's a dispute. It's like the occupation. Like some side wants the land and the other side wants the land. So we'll just consider it a dispute, and there's no facts there. But what I wanted to just say about the opposition demonstration and the pro-government events is that the message is very clear on both sides. From the government side, and when you interview people who are coming there, you're getting an anti-imperialist message, just pure opposition to U.S. involvement in this country. And I really don't think that I'm exaggerating when you go to these pro-opposition events, but particularly the one that was staged yesterday. It is what I would consider a pro-imperialist message, where they're actually beseeching the U.S. for intervention in the form of humanitarian aid. And when Juan Guaidó spoke, there were images of USAID, which is, the State Department run aid agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development, in the field, including with Guaidó flashing behind him. So it was kind of like a propaganda film for USAID, which is supposed to bring the aid in. And as we know, or those of us who've followed Venezuela, especially since the 2002 coup attempt against Hugo Chavez, know USAID has an Office of Transitional Initiatives, which has funded the Venezuelan opposition to the tune of over $50 million for the specific purpose of encouraging transition, encouraging regime change, training.
This is over what period of time?
I really began in 2007, and I wrote a piece about this with Dan Cohen, which is also up at the grayzoneproject.com. But 2002 was when one of the main groups that was participated in the coup, Sumate, which is the group of Maria Corina Machado, who is the main proxy of Marco Rubio here, who spoke yesterday. They were doing a lot of the grassroots efforts to rile up people against Chavez at that time.
So you're referring to the coup that the Bush administration supported but wound up not being successful, and that was against Chavez, right?
Right, and it's important to look back at that in the current context, although the context is a lot different. People are more exhausted. But, the coup initially succeeded. Chavez was taken away to an island. The military wasn't completely on his side yet. He didn't have control of military intelligence. Many people thought he was gone, that he was going to be executed. And the people, not just pouring out of the barrios, but even out of middle-class areas, marched on Miraflores Palace, demanding that he be returned. And just this mass spontaneous march took place, demanding that he be returned, because people here really value independence and sovereignty. And there is that mood now, although people are definitely worn down.
Yeah. Now, the standard, so let's talk a little about the history of the whole thing, because, there is the standard narrative we're hearing here, and you would probably emphasize different things than it's emphasizing. So let me tell you what basically my understanding is as the naive observer. So, okay, so first there was Hugo Chavez, very popular, charismatic. He dies. Maduro is his successor, probably less charismatic. He is said in the United States to be less popular than Chavez, although, he's certainly not without his supporters. There was an election. Now, were there one election or two? No, there was in his first election, he won narrowly, but won. Was there a subsequent election? Because you hear, whenever you hear about the election here, you hear that it's disputed or that that there was foul play, and that's one reason the results shouldn't be respected. Were there two elections, and they're talking about the second one mainly, or what?
Well, first of all, from Chavez's first election in 1998 until his death, there were actually 15 elections. The Carter Center affirmed them as the best elections in the world. In the last election, which took place last year, which the U.S. declared invalid, the Carter Center wasn't here, and it wasn't because they were banned. They simply prioritized their efforts elsewhere. There were election observers who affirmed the elections as clean. The three main opposition parties boycotted the elections. And this is a familiar tactic if you're looking at regime change operations and how they take place. And the U.S. was actually advising them to boycott the election. The opposition was very divided. Maduro actually was successfully divided the opposition. And so they felt like they couldn't win on their own. They had control over the National Assembly. So best thing to do is boycott it and delegitimize what was effectively a democratic institution.
This is the second Maduro election, the second election he won. Is that right?
Correct. The first one he narrowly won against Enrique Capriles Radonsky, who is actually a much more moderate figure than Juan Guaidó and his crew. But in the election that Maduro won, there was a lower turnout because a lot of the opposition people didn't vote, but there were two candidates who ran. The most important one being Henry Falcón, who is also considered, a moderate, sort of a centrist in Venezuela. And the U.S. actually urged him not to run and made some kind of verbal threats. The goal of the U.S. was to totally delegitimize the election, and then they simply declared that Maduro was a dictator and that this was a fake election. The fact is that 46% of the population voted for him. Millions of people came out to vote for him. And when you talk to people at pro-government rallies, they say, well, now our votes have been completely nullified by Washington, and this doesn't feel very democratic to us.
Now I assume he's also being accused. Is the main gripe about the election from the U.S. point of view that if the other side boycotts it, it doesn't count? Or aren't there also allegations of further wrongdoing on his part? The real main gripe of the U.S., the real gripe of the U.S. we can get to later, but in terms of the rhetoric of Washington is that he dissolved the National Assembly when in fact he held the National Assembly in contempt because of vote buying by at least 4 assembly members, including one who was Chavista. And the National Assembly was controlled by 4 opposition parties, which basically rotated in the presidency and were using it to basically wear down the government and obstruct it from getting anything done. In fact, in 2017, they passed a law called the Transition Law outlining their agenda for regime change. So the National Assembly was held in contempt. A constituent assembly, which was much more representative of the diversity of Venezuelan society, but which is considered a rubber stamp by Washington and the opposition, was replaced the National Assembly. This was called unconstitutional, but in the 1999 Constitution of Chavez, it was there was a provision to implement a constituent assembly if the National Assembly became held in contempt. Now, I gathered the dissolution, or whatever the correct term is for what happened in the National Assembly, that was validated by the Supreme Court, by the Venezuelan Supreme Court.
Yeah, and so the U.S. and the opposition say that the Supreme Court is stacked with Maduro loyalists. Maybe it is. I think that the U.S. Supreme Court, which installed George W. Bush as president, is stacked with Republican loyalists. So if this is a problem, it's not particular to Venezuela.
Yeah, there are. I mean, had there been more Democratic appointees in 2000, Bush versus Gore probably would have come out differently. But so that is to some extent life. You know,
the votes would have been counted.
Yeah, like so that's to some extent life with a court system that ultimately has to be constituted somehow, and usually some combination of legislative and executive authority is involved in constituting it. But I gather nobody's arguing that the Supreme Court had not been legitimately constituted, right? I mean, the justices were appointed in keeping with the Constitution. Is that right?
I don't hear any dispute about that. And the dispute, and you know what makes this all that much more ridiculous is that Juan Guaidó is being proclaimed as the constitutional leader of Venezuela when there isn't much constitutional basis for that. So I think all the constitutional arguments are kind of off the table when you just say, well, you know what? Washington said that Juan Guaidó is president, and so we're just going to roll with that. But by the way, we believe in democracy.
Okay. Now, the other another big part of what's discussed is, you know, the suffering of the Venezuelan people, the extent of the suffering, the extent to which Maduro or even a more longstanding socialist legacy is responsible, or the extent to which American sanctions are responsible. Now, what you hear, you're finally seeing a little discussion here that maybe these oil sanctions that Trump has imposed could actually hurt the Venezuelan people. At first, there wasn't much discussion of that at all here. But what I've heard about the deeper history of this is that, yes, Obama levied sanctions, but they were crafted to target elites. And so although that's naturally going to be an imperfectly precise targeting, it didn't hurt the economy broadly, or didn't kind of trickle down and hurt the common person or something. I mean, what do you take issue with in that, if anything?
No, that's a great question. Let me talk about the sanctions, and then I think there needs to be a little bit more context when we talk about the suffering of Venezuelans. And you know, we should also really acknowledge that head on. The sanctions that were first imposed by Obama, when Venezuela was declared inexplicably as a national security threat, were levied because of Obama's strategy, which was to welcome Cuba in and normalize relations with Cuba, but then to really start edging out the real threat in the region to U.S. hegemony, which is Venezuela, with PDVSA, the state oil company, and its ability to actually fund support other governments like it. And the long-term strategy was that Cuba would eventually, you know, start bringing in McDonald's, and Howard Schultz would have a town hall there on top of his new Starbucks in Havana's old city. You know, that was the strategy. It was a stupid strategy. But what Obama did was model his sanctions kind of along the lines of the Magnitsky Act, which targets government officials. But what the Magnitsky Act aims to do, and why it's so insidious, is that it actually does deep economic damage, because any business, particularly national businesses, become afraid of working with the government because they fear that they'll be sanctioned if they're identified too closely. And that's actually something that the Obama administration did to Nicaragua as well. So it's not just targeted sanctions against the bad guys. Another point about these sanctions is that the U.S. ambassador at the time, William Brownfield, who was basically acting as a proxy of the CIA, structured the sanctions so that everyone in Maduro's inner circle except for one figure was sanctioned, in order to create paranoia that one figure was a CIA asset. And this was reported by McClatchy. So sanctions they're not just insidious, they're invidious. And the sanctions that are being imposed on Venezuela now represent an economic blockade, so that to go out and get Pampers made by Huggies right now will cost you like $30 or $40 for a pack of Pampers. That's because of the sanctions.
The second order effects you're talking about do happen. That's the same thing is happening with Iran. I mean, those sanctions are much broader to begin with, but apparently some people are afraid to export food to Iran because, you know, they're just afraid of running afoul of the administration. So what was the official rationale for the sanctions by Obama? What had Venezuela done wrong?
If I'm not mistaken, it's that Venezuela was a national security threat. And there's all kinds of rationalizations, but
I mean, somebody told me that the official thing was like election irregularities. And I said, like, wait a second, we have like a number of allies that we give weapons to that don't even bother to have elections and are brutally repressive and violent dictators. And it's like, I mean, is it really our policy to go around sanctioning countries because they?
I mean, we've been talking about the policies and the rhetoric of Washington towards Venezuela. We need to understand the underlying motives, and it's pretty freaking obvious that it's about oil. That this country is an potential economic powerhouse, has been an economic powerhouse, and has the largest reserves of oil and I think gold in the Western Hemisphere. And you do have a kind of quasi-socialist government, a government that would like to be socialist, which has supported the government in Cuba, which has supported the government in Nicaragua, which was at one point at the heart of the pink tide in South America, which posed a real existential threat to American hegemony and to the whole concept of the Monroe Doctrine. And so Venezuela, for geopolitical reasons, for economic reasons, it threatens the elites who devise our foreign policy, and it's always been on the target board for that reason.
But see, I wouldn't expect Obama himself to be all that receptive to that logic. Was it more a matter of him feeling he had to kind of pay off various interest groups politically because he was opening up to Cuba, or what? What do you think was going on in his head? I really don't imagine him waking up at night worrying about an ascendant socialist power in South America.
I don't imagine him waking up and saying he wants to, slaughter Palestinian babies. But under Barack Obama, Israel was able to use more disproportionate force against Palestinians in the Gaza Strip than under any other president, including George W. Bush. Condoleezza Rice actually prevented, arguably, several Israeli assaults on Gaza. So Barack Obama, I mean, he was on foreign policy, one of the weakest presidents in our time. And you can look at his normalization with Cuba in the same light as the Iran deal, which was sort of about reining Iran in as a sort of country that represents resistance to U.S. hegemony. And that's why the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation actually funded the diplomacy around the Iran deal. I mean, what do they represent? They are the foreign policy establishment in a nutshell.
But see, I would say that Obama, to the extent that he let things happen with Israel that you'd rather not happen, and by the way, Israel didn't want the Iran deal to happen. Apparently, he had to encounter a lot of blowback from Israel to get it done. I mean, you can say that's a comment on the ridiculous state of play in that region, but that's a fact. And anyway, I mean, to get back to Venezuela, I would say that Obama himself, I don't think was, particularly pro-Israel in the Washington sense of being kind of pro-right-wing Israeli regime and pro-occupation. In fact, his parting shot, if you'll recall, was a UN vote, or at least an abstention from a veto, that drove Bibi crazy. So I think in that case, it was about the politics and about political opposition he didn't feel he could, endure and so on. And I'm just wondering if you think that the same thing is true in Venezuela. I mean, maybe you don't. In other words,
if you want to talk about the way Washington works, I think, you can look at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as kind of a new Obama, this new kind of attractive blank screen that aspirational young people can project their ambitions upon. And she's clearly made this kind of Faustian bargain to not talk about foreign policy, not challenge the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, and soak in one puff piece and one positive media profile after another. And then she'll get her kind of empty Green New Deal to defend and advocate for. That's the way I see so many Democrats in Washington function, and they make this bargain to not put up resistance to what is effectively a deep state. I call it the national security state. And look at what Obama's become in his post-presidency. I mean, his post-presidency is absolutely shameful. It's just an endless splash fight with Richard Branson on a private island, while Michelle Obama sells 1 million books about nothing. That's what he made this bargain, and he, is someone who didn't make a ton of money before he was president, and now he's going to be very wealthy and very comfortable, and that's who we can see Obama as.
You're a tough crowd, man. I mean, AOC is already too mainstream for you.
I mean, I think a lot of people are seeing, and not to shift subjects too much, I think we can come back to this, but I think a lot of people who really invested hopes in her because she said she was a socialist, because she was close to the Democratic Socialists of America, are seeing what she is in the way that she kind of threw Ilhan Omar under the bus over the AIPAC debate that Ilhan Omar sparked yesterday.
Now, did she? What did AOC? Okay, so for people who have been in a cave or something, Representative Omar basically said, asserted on Twitter that politicians were supporting Israel because they were getting money from AIPAC. If I got that right, I don't remember the exact sequence of tweets. And she said it with the phrase, "It's all about the Benjamins." And so she was accused of playing in anti-Semitic tropes, and she wound up apologizing. Did AOC, did she just kind of remain silent or what? I mean, I know like Nancy Pelosi, I mean, the Democratic establishment certainly made it clear they wanted an apology. Did AOC just not say anything?
I hope this doesn't fly over the heads of people who aren't really involved in the weeds of Israel-Palestine politics. But first of all, AOC did not defend Ilhan Omar. She didn't stick up for her. She had what appears to be a series of meetings with a group called If Not Now, which is sort of one of these Jewish American youth groups that fashions itself as non-Zionist and emerged out of the ranks of J Street, which is a liberal Zionist lobby that, supported a two-state solution, opposed BDS fervently, and, I thought was kind of on the wrong side of history on Palestine. And through those meetings, AOC basically welcomed Ilhan Omar's apology and this idea that Omar needed to actually apologize for stating something that was obviously true to those of us who know, like, anything about the Israel lobby and how it operates. I think there are other reasons besides the Benjamins, like geopolitics, like anti-Arab and anti-Palestinian racism, the religion of the Christian Zionist lobby. There's many, but it's basically true. AIPAC.
Well, I mean, all interest groups use money in Washington, and most of them brag about their success, including AIPAC.
Yes, Alan Dershowitz said that AIPAC and the Israel lobby was the most successful venture, one of the most successful ventures that Jews in history had ever organized. Thomas Friedman said that Netanyahu's standing ovations before Congress were bought and paid for by AIPAC. Peter Beinart reported that every member of Congress brought their top AIPAC donor with them to that notorious Netanyahu speech, where he was invited by the opposition leader to denounce the president of the United States. So there you have it. It's really obvious. And Ocasio-Cortez did not defend Ilhan Omar. She met with this group, which grew out of J Street, and then when Omar apologized and said she's learning the history of anti-Semitism from her Jewish allies, AOC welcomed that, and I found that really condescending because here you have a Somali American refugee, someone who's really representing her constituents in Minneapolis and how they feel about Palestinians and how her family and her community probably feel about Palestinians, someone from a community that's been heavily surveilled by the FBI. I think ultra-privileged white American Jews should be learning history from her. We should be learning lessons from her. And for AOC to say in this condescending way, well, it's good that she did this. Hooray, you've learned your lesson. Now move on. And not defend her on one of the most critical issues. After coming into Congress on the basis of, being a socialist and representing this change from business as usual in the Democratic Party, a change from Representative Joe Crowley, who was a J Street Democrat, I think that's really lamentable. And I think a lot of people are seeing the Faustian bargain she made, which is to not challenge the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, to allow business to take place as usual and soak in the positive PR that she's going to get, just as Obama did.
Yeah, I don't remember the details, but she said something about foreign policy very early on, before she even took office, I think, and then kind of had to walk it back or something. But, she's been kind of, she seems to be focusing her firepower on domestic policy. Before we get back to Venezuela, I should say, just by way of plugging something you're kind of in, right? During the whole Omar anti-Semitism remark controversy, allegedly anti-Semitic remark controversy, I saw that The Intercept kind of re-upped this video that had been done by Al Jazeera, but then under some kind of pressure, Al Jazeera did not run it. It was about AIPAC. They had actually sent people undercover to secretly record what people in AIPAC and allied organizations said and so on. And you make an appearance in this, right? You weren't in the one that I saw, but anyway, if people will link to one of those, because it finally surfaced, even though Al Jazeera never broadcast it. It's a multi-part series. What I saw is pretty interesting, and we'll link to that on the Blogging Heads TV site under links mentioned next to this video. So on Venezuela,
it's called The Lobby. Just so people know, it's called The Lobby USA. And the news and opinion site Electronic Intifada has put all 4 episodes of it online, and it's a hidden camera investigation of the Israel lobby in Washington that I participated in. And I think it's, if you want to understand how the lobby works, watch this, and it's really entertaining. And it was censored by Al Jazeera under threat from the Israel lobby while they were under embargo from Saudi Arabia.
That is, you mean while Qatar, where Al Jazeera was under embargo?
Basically, the Emir of Qatar ordered Al Jazeera to censor this documentary so that it would never be released, because he was under pressure from, well, of course, he was threatened with a invasion from Saudi Arabia. And so Saudi Arabia and Israel have this special relationship whereby to get out from under that embargo, the Qatari monarchy decided that we're going to work different Trump influencers, and we're going to work through the Israel lobby to get out from under this rock that we're under. And that entailed suppressing that documentary. They were actually given specific instructions by pro-Israel lawmakers to suppress that documentary, the Lobby USA, or face foreign agent registration for Al Jazeera, as well as the threat of a Saudi invasion.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the series is, I think it's on YouTube and on the Electronic Intifada site. Now back to Venezuela. So I think we've established that in your view, it's far from clear that there are valid constitutional reasons to consider the Maduro regime illegitimate, although many countries have deemed it such. On the question of the extent of, and it is your view that the U.S. has been much more complicit in what economic deprivation there is in Venezuela than is commonly recognized, because I guess you think that the Obama sanctions actually did have actual impact in that regard.
Well, I mean, the Obama sanctions were just the gateway drug for the Trump administration, which is just ordered the Bank of England to not return $1.3 billion in gold assets that it was holding on behalf of the Venezuelan government, and to direct them into the sort of self-declared Juan Guaidó government. That's in addition to something like $17 billion in assets that the U.S. has seized. And the U.S. has gone ahead and appointed, through Marco Rubio, as handpicking 5 members of Citgo's board. Citgo is the U.S. arm of PDVSA, which is a state-owned oil company. So it's obvious that there's an economic attack on Venezuela that's unlike anything we've seen against this country. It's very similar. Yeah, go ahead.
Did that start at the beginning of the Trump administration? What we've mainly heard about is very recent stuff that couldn't be responsible for any deprivation as of a year or two ago. But did they start playing hardball at the beginning of the Trump administration?
I think in the summer of 2017, when Hurricane Harvey hit the U.S. and Maduro personally offered to send humanitarian aid to the U.S., by that point, the U.S. had sanctioned Venezuela 3 times already by that point. And the Wall Street Journal reported this month, that on the second day of Trump coming into office, he raised the issue of Venezuela and regime change.
Okay. On the question of the extent of the suffering, I mean, there must be appreciable deprivation. If the accounts are right about the number of refugees, right? What I'm hearing is 3 million people have left Venezuela out of a population of 30 million or something. So
the Venezuelan government has never received numbers from other countries about how many have left, but the estimates here are closer to 2 million. This would be, in a country of 30 million, about the same percentage that have left Ireland.
You mean Ireland in what? Well, yeah, but in that case, it wasn't. You mean net outflow immigration from Ireland over the same period, percentage-wise?
Correct.
Okay, but there the motivation was different, right? It wasn't that. It wasn't. I mean,
Definitely. I mean, you had a highly trained population, highly educated population, and an economy that couldn't support them with the kind of jobs they're qualified for, so they went elsewhere. Here, there are many different forms of suffering, and the word deprivation only fits a portion of the population. The people protesting, I mean, it's just, the irony is really in your face that the people protesting yesterday for regime change, who came out to support Juan Guaidó in Chacao, are very well fed and affluent and people of means. And they, when I would ask them about that and be like, you look like you're better fed than I am. I mean, I don't eat steak, but anyway, they would just say, well, we're here to protest on behalf of the people who are suffering. And the fact is, there is an economic crisis in this country, and people are facing it in different ways.
Yeah. So you said early on that you think the outcome is going to be different from what's anticipated in the West. I mean, you think the momentum of the opposition is greatly exaggerated or something?
Well, first of all, I think there are a lot of Venezuelans who might want to change from Maduro, but who are Chavistas, and they would like a change within the PSUV party. And so it's possible Maduro doesn't finish his term, but there are many different figures who could come in who would represent the legacy of Hugo Chavez. There's a massive base here that reveres Hugo Chavez and has a very strong anti-imperialist education and believes in different forms of socialism because they've actually seen the benefits. They saw the benefits during the oil boom when Chavez had crushed the opposition and he started to implement what he called 21st century socialism. And, just driving around and walking around the outskirts of Caracas, going into 23 de Enero, which is the real, base of Chavismo. It's a very poor barrio. You actually see the benefits that people receive. It's real. Education, CLAP, which is a free food program every month, healthcare, all of those things that they didn't have before, and also the feeling that they're not excluded from society. Talking to journalists, journalistic colleagues here who are Chavistas, and they would tell me, I have darker skin, I wasn't educated, and now I'm a high-profile journalist who's covering my side of society, and before I wasn't allowed in media. So that's real. The other thing is that you have like neocons in Washington, the same people who shaped so many boneheaded policies and interventions over the past 20 years. It looks like they've miscalculated again. And watching Elliot Abrams' testimony today at the House Foreign Affairs Committee is pretty good indication of that. He said, we actually don't know. He kind of said, we don't know what's going to happen. They thought the military was going to defect. They thought the military was going to move to the other side, and the military is strongly behind, if not Maduro, then behind what he represents, as well as the police and as well as a massive base of the population. Then you have the middle class here. What's left of the middle class? It's true that many young people have simply left, and a lot of them are actually having a hard time in their host countries in South America and are facing discrimination there. But the middle class had known a higher standard of living because they're in a petro state than a lot of other people in Latin America, and they're not experiencing that there now. They can't hope for a second car. They can't hope for a vacation home, and they're having to work longer hours than they had before. There's also a water crisis where some people aren't getting regular water supplies and they have to stock up. And then you have hyperinflation, which has been brought on by speculation. Sanctions are compounding it. The Obama sanctions actually made it really difficult for the government to start to restructure its debt or to control hyperinflation. And now it's it's hard to see a way out of it. And so, when I go to the market here, rice will be cheap. Toilet paper will be really expensive. Oatmeal will cost like $5 and nobody knows why. And one item, the shelves are stocked and there aren't lines. That stuff isn't happening, but people won't know why one thing's expensive one day and why another isn't. And it's because of speculation. And another thing to keep in mind is that 2/3 of the economy is controlled by private interests who largely support the opposition And in many ways, they're hoarding supplies, they're hoarding food, and they are speculating on prices and setting the exchanges in a way that is dooming this government. But I really do not think that the coup has worked. Just to wrap up, I think the coup has failed internally. And the opposition rally I witnessed yesterday was just bizarre in how it was structured. And there didn't seem to be any momentum there.
Were there a lot of people there?
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people there. A lot of people come out to rallies here, period. And everything's very polarized. And, you know, the reason many people came out, I think, is because they still sense that this is their moment. The opposition is united in a way it hasn't been in a long time, because they feel that the U.S. is behind them all the way. But I would expect sort of dwindling crowds going forward, because I don't know, I expected some kind of game changer, or the aid to come through, and then there to be some kind of skirmish with the military and an escalation. And then a lot of people on the pro-government side were predicting garimbas, which are these violent riots that have taken place sporadically that night, and that didn't take place. And so it kind of just fizzled out, and a lot of people were like, this is it? So I actually think the neocons and the Trump administration and Marco Rubio have miscalculated in a big way, and now they're making it up as they go along in this reality show coup.
Now, you mentioned food aid. So, yeah, apparently the U.S. sent food toward the border. Their plan was to deliver it basically to the control of Guaidó, the opposition leader. That was the U.S. plan, as I understand it, to put it in his hands. Maduro naturally wasn't enthusiastic about that. In any event, he said, no, take your food. We don't need it. I mean, I was kind of wondering, why didn't he say, sure, just give it to us and we'll decide how it's distributed and make sure it doesn't get into Guaidó's hands? But apparently he just doesn't like the optics of seeming to be, I don't know. Well, what's your interpretation of how that whole thing played out?
That's such an important question. And it's really unfortunate that the media in the U.S. isn't engaging this as a question, and they're sort of taking the Trump administration at its good faith word that this is just aid that they're going to send in. First of all, you have Elliot Abrams overseeing the policy on Venezuela. This is someone who pioneered the strategy of using humanitarian aid as a cover for delivering arms to U.S.-backed proxy forces in Central America. That's what Elliot Abrams does. Second of all, you have USAID's terrible history in Venezuela and throughout Latin America, where it has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to encourage regime change by funding civil society and media that are openly seeking to foment the removal of governments that the U.S. simply doesn't like. And then finally, you have the fact that there may be a military presence, a U.S. or Colombian military presence alongside USAID, which would effectively represent an invasion. And finally, I wouldn't say finally, there are two more points. It's clearly a violation of Venezuelan sovereignty. If a country that's calling for the removal of a government is seeking to just ram trucks across the border without permission, so it's a way of basically demonstrating that this government has lost control over its own borders. And then you have the I don't know if sorry. Then finally, you have the real fear of this being used as a kind of pretext for escalation. Because if the military is not going to let the aid in, and the U.S. is going to send it anyway, there's going to be some kind of clash. And if you remember, the way George H.W. Bush justified Panama, you remember he was being called a wimp. And he said, when a U.S. soldier is kicked in the testicles by Panamanian military personnel, we're not going to accept that, because U.S. soldiers were beaten. I think one might have been killed. The soldiers were kind of being used, to stir things up on the ground to justify an intervention. Or Grenada, with the U.S. students in Grenada. So that's what the aid represents. And in so many ways, it represents the advance guard of a humanitarian R2P style intervention. And you've actually had two major opposition leaders 2 days ago, Antonio Ledesma and Maria Corina Machado, who I said before was Marco Rubio's proxy here, who's been involved in several violent plots against Chavez. call explicitly for a Libya-style R2P intervention. So that's what USAID really represents to the Venezuelan government and to many Venezuelan people. And the aid, I mean, we're talking about $50 million in aid. It's like food boxes. It's not going to solve the problem here.
Yeah. Now, as for the problem, would you say to some appreciable extent there has been kind of mismanagement or bad policy or whatever under Maduro or under Chavez?
No one denies, even people I talk to in the government, no one denies there's been corruption. Corruption is kind of part of the way governments have functioned here ever since this became a petro-state. And so I think one of the former directors of PDVSA, the former state oil company, extorted billions of dollars and is now in the U.S. after this government attempted to arrest him. But he was a major figure in PSUV, the party of Maduro. So there clearly is corruption. But I mean, it's not like there wasn't corruption in the 90s on a possibly greater scale when much of the population of Venezuela was completely excluded from the economy.
But you don't see the problem as being socialist policies per se, which is in some corners of America, of course, part of this, more on the right than the left, but big part of the narrative.
Yeah, you have the Republicans trying to link that what they see as Venezuelan socialism to the Democrats, to Ocasio-Cortez and whoever declared themselves a socialist in order to get credulous young people in Brooklyn or wherever to vote for them. But basically, this is not a socialist society as a whole, because as I said, 2/3 of the society is 2/3 of the economy is controlled by private business interests. I mean, and just look at the media and the way it functions in Venezuela. Most of it is privately owned. Most of it is pro-opposition. They're saying things that I couldn't even imagine Fox News saying in favor of regime change. And they're able to operate here. In many ways, it really feels to me like the opposition and its economic base is stronger than this government. So what you constantly hear from the grassroots Chavistas is that what we need to solve this problem is more socialism. And that's increasingly difficult because the government is unable to even receive its own assets in gold and oil and use it to fund social programs or use it to offset the black market. Mm-hmm. Today, Maduro gave an interview to Al Mayadeen, the Lebanese network, and he said that they're going to increase gold production and tap into new stores of aluminum and other minerals and going to increase assets. But, that's a message to his base that we're going to continue to fund social programs. I think the U.S. economic war, though, it aims to basically cancel whatever exists of socialism here.
Yeah, so how does this play out in the long run? I mean, I take it your sense is just that there was the expectation on the part of people in the Trump administration that we were approaching some kind of climax and popular support was going to be sufficiently, evidently in support of Guaidó, that the military was going to flip or something. And your sense is that didn't happen. It seems like the moment has passed. But even assuming that's true, like you play this out long run, the kinds of sanctions that Venezuela is subject to now would seem to foretell a future of growing economic crisis, right? I mean, what do you expect? Leaving aside the possibility of arms, I mean, we'll get into arms later. You're probably aware that the Maduro regime says they intercepted illicit arms shipments coming from Miami. We'll talk about that in a second. But just on the, in the sense, isn't time on the side of the opposition, just in the sense that in any country, if suffering becomes sufficiently acute, it's a bad time to be the ruler?
Yeah, I mean, it was a bad time for Nicolas Maduro to come into power because oil prices went down. Oil prices go down. And also when U.S. allies increase production in order to weaken Venezuela, as the Saudis have done from time to time, things get worse here. That's what the economy is largely based around. So, now that there's the economic war is out in the open, the U.S. is going to double down on it, especially if it fails to achieve its goals, which I think it will. You'll continue to see an exodus of the middle class and, the upper class as well. Although, in many ways, the upper class benefits from the black market. That would resemble, increasingly, the country could resemble Cuba more. I was in Cuba during the special period, which was after the fall of the Soviet Union and the economy was in shambles, and Fidel attempted to restructure the economy around tourism just to survive and have liquidity. And the situation was horrible in the streets. I mean, it was absolutely horrible. And I couldn't understand how they could survive. But one of the ways that the Cuban government survived was through consent. There was a lot of popular consent, partly because the leadership really was experiencing the same pain that the people were experiencing. And there is a feeling here that among some of the Chavistas I've talked to, that this government isn't experiencing the pain in the same way. That could lead to a shakeup. But I think, when you talk about the PSUV and you talk about Chavismo, that's here to stay. And I don't see it being replaced or disappeared or purged from Venezuela. People here will not, I think the majority here will not accept another neoliberal government. And before we look forward into the long-term future, I think it's important that we look at the somewhat recent past. We consider what happened in 1989 when you had a government basically implement full-scale neoliberalism, and you had the Caracazo, which is just the first real riot across Caracas, when people rose up out of the barrios and demanded an end to this inequality. It sort of set the stage for Chavez, who attempted a coup in 1992 as a military colonel to answer those concerns. Chavez became a deeply popular figure from 1992 onwards and decided, against the advice of his inner circle, to run for president in 1998. Swept the election because you had a government in power then, a social democratic government. They proclaimed themselves social democrats, Acción Democrática, democratic action. And they said they were against neoliberalism, and then they accepted the IMF structural adjustment package and eliminated any form of Keynesianism in Venezuela. Chavez comes into power. He fights the oligarchy, gains control of the state oil company in 2003, and then begins funding the social programs. And anyone who lived through that period remembers that and will fight for that if they are not from the upper middle class or upper class. It's the young people who don't remember it, who may be sort of on board for a wider change. But but I can tell you, the party that Juan Guaidó is from, Voluntad Popular, Popular Will, has very little support. And I think the opposition is going to start to fragment the longer this goes on. There will be talks. I think, hopefully we can see negotiations brokered maybe by Mexico and López Obrador. And then we'll see what happens. We could also see a new leadership in Washington if somehow the Democrats get their act together. And that's, a question for another day.
Yeah, Mexico's playing an interesting role. I mean, it has a relatively, compared to its past, left-wing government, and they have refused to join other Latin American nations that are siding with the Trump administration on this. As for the opposition splitting, I gather that this whole kind of maneuver that Guaidó kind of did, in terms of declaring himself president and getting U.S. support, surprised a number of other, parts of the opposition, right? I mean, it was kind of a fait accompli. I mean, he did, this was apparently a deal done in advance with the U.S. If I declare myself president, will you immediately recognize me? Right? That seems to have happened in conversations with Pence or something. And that was a surprise to some of the other people in the opposition, but it sounds like for the time being, they've fallen into line.
Well, it was a surprise for Juan Guaidó. He didn't know he was going to be president until Pence called him and said, "You're going to be president."
Oh, you think the initiative, actually, the whole idea came from the U.S.?
Well, I think that, you should read my piece I did with Dan Cohen on the making of Juan Guaidó, because, him and his crew, his cadre from Popular Will, had always wanted this to happen and always imagined themselves in this scenario. So I think this is part of a long-term project, but Juan Guaidó never saw himself as the future president until Pence called him. And this is just reported in the Wall Street Journal, which has actually been getting some of the best sources on the Trump administration.
The journal's reporting is underrated in general, I think, but partly because of the taint of its editorial page. But anyway,
right. Yeah, right. And so Guaidó also didn't see himself as a future president because he, until 2015, had not even been an assembly member. He was a deputy. He comes from one of the least populous states in Venezuela. He is not, in his own party, someone who is particularly well known. 81% of Venezuelans hadn't heard of him before January 22nd, when he self-proclaimed himself the president. And the real figure that his party is represented by is Leopoldo Lopez, who's under house arrest, who had absolutely been involved in violent activities seeking the overthrow of the government, violent destabilizing activities, which we've documented at the Gray Zone. He is the portrait of aristocracy. He looks like me or you. He's as white as us. The direct descendant of Venezuela's first president. He is extremely wealthy. His mother, I think, looted PDVSA in the 90s. And he's not extremely popular, partly because him and his party were heavily involved in the Gorimbas, which were, they placed Caracas under siege in 2016. Luis Vicente Leon, who's one of the most prominent pollsters in Venezuela, he's not pro-Chavez, said that Guaido's party has less than 20% of the vote and commands only a small slice of the population because, in his words, Venezuelans don't want war. But that's kind of the strategy of direct confrontation, no negotiation, no dialogue that popular will represents. And they were actually, as me and Dan Cohen documented, trained by this Belgrade-based group, Otpor, that brought down Milosevic, which was funded by USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, and apparently by the CIA directly. And they've trained thousands of students and activists around the world to destabilize governments that the U.S. does not want in power. This isn't in line with what a lot of Venezuelans want, who want economic prosperity, but they also want stability, and they don't want riots in the streets all the time. I mean, literally, Leopoldo Lopez and his crew put entire parts of the city under siege so that people who even kind of supported them couldn't get out to get groceries or to meet their relatives. And people don't want to go back to that. So Guaidó comes along. I saw him speak yesterday. He speaks like it's remarkable to see him in person. He speaks like barely above a whisper. It required a lot of more veteran opposition leaders to whip up the crowd before he came on. There were very few applause lines. The crowd, which loves him because they've invested all their hopes in him, he's like an Obama figure for them, started to leave early as he was speaking. And you can see how clearly stage managed he is. So I think the reason Guaidó was chosen is because, first of all, he looks mestizo like most Venezuelans. He's from a more humble family than the rest of the guys in his party who are from oligarchic families. And they wanted someone that people could relate to in this interim period. But now it's unclear what their strategy is. Guaidó is overexposed. He's starting to do interviews with hostile or critical media. He did an actually pretty embarrassing interview with RT 3 days ago, and RT released all these videos pointing out his open lies and mocking him. And I think that they're looking to replace him with Leopoldo Lopez, but that can only happen if Lopez is out of house arrest, and that can only happen if the Maduro government is completely removed, and that can only happen if the military revolts, and that ain't going to happen.
Well, it sounds like hard logic to argue with. I mean, so your view is, first of all, there is just a strong tradition of opposition to what Guaidó represents, which is to say the ruling class, roughly speaking, and what it's done in the past. And you think that, leaving aside the question of whether Maduro is quite the charismatic figure that Hugo Chavez was, that whole legacy works in his favor right now. The big momentum shift that you think Washington and Guaidó expected to happen hasn't happened. And you think, even with this scenario where economic conditions become worse under continued sanctions, the government can survive. I mean, it seems like one hope from your point of view might be that eventually, if the regime change doesn't happen, that people in America, the left in America, and maybe some center-left people start making noise about how cruel it is to the Venezuelan people to sustain these sanctions. Now, I got to tell you, you got some work to do before that happens, because right now, Maduro does not have much sympathy in the mainstream media, and there's a lot of, on center, left, and left, there's like, I'm against regime change, but, so I think you'd have to see a real shift of opinion. On the other hand, it doesn't seem crazy that it could happen. There's a whole lot of anti-Trump sentiment on the left, of course, and if so that could work in the favor of this kind of pressure. Do you think that scenario is possible? That ultimately the sanctions could actually have to go by the wayside because of domestic pressure? I mean, we're a long way from that right now.
Well, first of all, on March 16th, there's going to be a mass march in Washington against U.S. intervention. It's not a march in support of the Venezuelan government, because there's a broad base of groups participating that they just wanted to send a clear message of opposition to U.S. intervention. And I agreed to put my name on the organizing committee because I'm just out there opposing regime change. So what's the harm? I hope that a lot of, there'll be large participation. That'll be a good gauge, if the weather's good enough, of how much street presence what's left of the left in the U.S. can mobilize around this issue, because it is considered a national march. I've also noticed that, Democracy Now!, which was sort of the flagship program of the left in the U.S. Going back to the Clinton era, has kind of come back. Amy Goodman's kind of come back to the old Amy Goodman after platforming a lot of the regime change tricks and schemes around Syria and Libya, and not really putting much opposition up to those. And, Amy's and Democracy Now! Have been doing a great job on Venezuela. That really does tell you something. It tells you about the connections that were built during the Chavez years between the American and Western left and the grassroots Chavistas of Venezuela, that they're actually willing to put themselves out there and say, you know what, this government is doing something that we stand for. And beyond that, it's much better than an oligarchic opposition. And then finally, we have the whole record of regime change attempts: Syria, Libya. I would also put Nicaragua in there. I documented a lot of the violence that took place against supporters of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua that the U.S. media ignored, but that was horrible. And Iraq, of course, and the sanctions on Iraq. There's this track record of regime change. And, you mean
Iraq or Iran? You mean Iraq or Iran when you mentioned this?
Well, the sanctions on Iraq in the 90s were,
I see. Okay.
Whether you agree with the Lancet statistics on, hundreds of thousands of dead children or not, they were terrible for the civilian population. So I think the left in the U.S., wherever they stand, kind of recognizes this. And I do feel, especially after watching Elliott Abrams come under questioning from the Democrats on the Foreign Affairs Committee in the House, particularly Ilhan Omar, who challenged him on whether or not he would fund a proxy group that commits human rights crimes, as he has done in the past, whether he would agree to arm them or not, as he's done in the past.
What did he say? I haven't seen it.
He refused to answer the question.
Yeah.
He refused to answer. Just to see that level of questioning shows me that there is actual opposition to the Trump administration's policies. So, I mean, I'll leave it there, but I think, to make this argument against regime change in Venezuela is much easier than when I tried to do so on Syria.
Yeah, I would say you're not. Yeah, I can see why that would be the case. So it does, though. I mean, it's sufficiently determined, Elliott Abrams, like I said, apparently arms were being secretly shipped from Miami to Venezuela. One shipment was interdicted, but by that time, apparently the there had been a number of these flights, and there was somebody called attention to this kind of suspicious round circuit of flights starting in January from Miami, same company, blah, blah, blah. And I think there were several flights in before they finally intercepted one and found arms. Right. So, I mean, that just suggests that there's real activity on this front. It would surprise me if Elliot Abrams didn't know about that. Maybe I'm naive, but in any event, he certainly wouldn't mind if he did know about it. Right. And he's the guy the Trump administration has selected to be their Venezuela point man. And then there's the separate question of like actual American troop intervention. They're not unrelated, because you can imagine fomenting an actual civil war and then say, well, now our troops have to come in. But how live a possibility do you think that kind of action is?
I mean, that's a real fear here. One quick point is that at the opposition rally yesterday, I asked everyone I spoke to, do you support U.S. military intervention in any form? And almost everyone opposes it. That's just not something Venezuelans want, no matter where they stand on this government. But on the Chavista side, there is a fear of irregular warfare that would come from the Colombian border. And there's just this historic enmity between Colombia and Venezuela. Colombia is the Israel of South America. It's a U.S. bulwark. It has a right-wing president, and it has a military that's participated in covert activity in the past, supported by the U.S. So there's a real fear there that it would have a destabilizing effect. I think, if the U.S. does decide to arm the moderate rebels in Venezuela to the extent that they exist, hundreds of thousands will die and millions will leave. And it's not clear to me that anyone in Washington really wants to foment another massive refugee crisis. Today, in his interview with Al Mayadeen, Nicolas Maduro said that his government had gained wind of a new U.S. assassination plot against him. And it used to be that when Chavez would say the U.S. wants to invade or the U.S. wants to assassinate me, he'd be laughed at in mainstream U.S. media. Now it has to be taken seriously, because last year there was a clear plot to assassinate Maduro at a military parade by drone, by dropping bombs on him by drone. Government here identified the plotters. Some of them actually took credit for it. They're in Colombia. And of course, the U.S. did nothing. The Colombian government did nothing. So that fear is it's a real fear. There is precedent for it. Okay.
All right. I think we've kind of covered the waterfront. Anything else you want to say?
No, we'll be reporting more from Venezuela over the next days and weeks at grayzoneproject.com. And, as you mentioned, Moderate Rebel is the best podcast aside from Blogging Heads. So check that out.
It's neck and neck, I'll tell you, between Blogging Heads and Moderate Rebels. But yeah, it's definitely an alternative perspective that's worth listening to. I always learn something when I listen to it. And I've a couple of guests I've kind of gotten from listening to them first on Moderate Rebels.
Great. Well, we'll have to poach some from you.
Yeah, there's plenty to go around. I think some of them wouldn't be to your liking, but then again, you're a very selective person. So there's that. Now you've got a book coming out in the spring. What's that on?
It's called The Management of Savagery. It's on Verso. I think it'll be out in March or April. I don't know.
And it's about?
And the book is really relevant, especially those question you asked about irregular warfare, pre-warfare in Latin America, but it deals with this issue in the Middle East, the history of the U.S. national security state supporting Salafi jihadi elements in the Middle East and Central Asia in order to put its geopolitical goal and the blowback that's caused. And so I basically chart a parallel history of international jihadism and the international far right from Europe to the U.S. and show how the two both been fueled by the national security state and how this resulted in the political crisis we're facing in the U.S. and across Europe in the form of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, nationalists from Austria to the UK, where they're driving Brexit, and how I think the bipartisan resistance in Washington and many of the figures associated with it, who described themselves as the steady state in the anonymous letter by a Trump official, warning that they actually control, declaring that they actually control what Donald Trump does, that was published in the New York Times, how the steady state is actually the destabilizing state, and how, and so I'm basically charting and pointing the finger at it for its responsibility for so many of the political crises we face, whether it's a refugee crisis in Europe, whether it's the destabilization of Libya and the rise of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, or it's the Trump presidency.
Yeah, the use of the term destabilizing is an interesting one. You could write a book about that. Just also the use of the word regime, as you've been using a lot.
Yeah.
So, okay, so that's coming out in the spring, and maybe we'll have you on again to talk about that when it comes out. And you tweet at, is it just at Max Blumenthal? Is that it? Straight to where, is that right?
As long as Twitter lets me stay.
What's that?
As long as Twitter lets me stay on.
Oh, you think you're in trouble?
I don't do anything that I think violates their terms of service, but me and all of my colleagues are definitely worried about suppression on social media platforms. I mean, I was just being facetious and making a joke, but
okay, well,
it's coming.
If you wind up in Twitter jail, I'll be protesting on your behalf on Twitter, and I carry a lot of weight, as you know.
Yeah, definitely.
So, okay, so you're at Max Blumenthal. I am at Robert Writer, WRIGHTER on Twitter, and grayzone.com, grayzone.com or grayzoneproject.com?
Okay, grayzoneproject.com. We're working on buying the grayzone.com.
Okay.
But grayproject.com, that's where all my reporting and my colleagues' reporting appears.
Okay. Okay, well, we will stay tuned then. Thanks, Max.
Yeah, thanks for me on, Bob.
Okay, bye-bye.